Greetings, students, and welcome to Chapter 9, Cellular Respiration and Fermentation, in this Unit 3 on cellular energy. So in this screencast, we're going to begin looking at the process of eating. So, here's an image of a guy. He was actually the champion of a hot dog eating contest. I placed 7th, not bad. But the question for this chapter here is, why is eating a thing? Like, why do we need food? I think we know inherently that food provides us with energy, but what's actually happening to that food in our body, and how does that food actually provide us with energy? Um, so let's take a look at just kind of energy and how we harvest that. To begin, I want to zoom way out and just look at an ecosystem as a whole. I'm guessing most of you are probably familiar with this idea that most of the energy on Earth here comes from the sun. And so most ecosystems are dependent on the sun. Note that I say most. There are some in the deep sea that are actually dependent on the flow of magma up from the Earth's core, which is kind of interesting, through these deep sea hydrothermal vents. But for the most part, we're all dependent on the sun. And so what happens is the sun sort of shines down. The plants capture that sun's light through a process known as photosynthesis, and then animals capture energy from the plants through this process called cellular respiration. And then other animals eat those animals, and get their energy also through cellular respiration. And so we kind of have these two processes. We have photosynthesis, where we capture the sun's light energy and use it to build sugars. And then we have cellular respiration, where animals will eat those plants and then break those sugars down to produce usable energy in the form of ATP. And so there's this kind of flow of energy through an ecosystem. It comes in through sunlight, it passes through these organisms, and ultimately it comes out as heat. You'll notice that in every transfer of energy, heat is given off, heat is given off, heat is given off, heat is given off. So it comes in as sunlight, it comes out as heat, and it just kind of flows through these living things. Just to recap, the first and second laws of thermodynamics, again, living things are not independent of the laws of physics and chemistry. So these laws are very much at play. First law, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change forms. And so here we see light energy being used to produce the chemical energy in that carbohydrate. And then that chemical energy of the carbohydrate is used by the animal to build fats, maybe to build proteins, and so we're again converting it into a different type of chemical energy. And then that chemical energy is converted to another form of chemical energy, ATP, and then some of that energy is even given off as heat, which is yet another form. So we see lots of transfers of energy happening. We also see the second law of thermodynamics in action, in that the entropy of the universe is always increasing. The formula for cellular respiration, which we're going to get to in later screencast, is down here, conveniently covered up by that little menu, but you can see we have this complex glucose molecule, C6H12O6, being broken down into carbon dioxide and water. So again, one highly ordered glucose molecule being broken down into 6 independently moving CO2s and 6 independently moving waters. So the randomness of the universe is in fact increasing as animals carry out cellular respiration. So those laws are very much at play. We can even look at this diagram at more of a cellular level, and we see that there's really 2 organelles that are at the core of what's happening in this diagram, and those organelles are the chloroplast and the mitochondria. So autotrophs are called self-feeders. Auto meaning self, troph meaning feeder. These are organisms that can make their own food. And so they're using the energy from the sun to make sugars. And this process is photosynthesis. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, are other feeders. These use that chemical energy of food to make ATP. So they're basically taking that glucose that was probably eaten by eating a plant or another animal. They get that energy, that food from some critter that they ate, and then they break it down into CO2 and water to make ATP. Note, by the way, that plants do carry out cellular respiration. but are still considered autotrophs because they can make their own sugars. So that's like a big AP test question that pretty much every year they talk about. Do plants do cellular respiration? Yes, plants are always doing cellular respiration as well. So keep that in mind. Plants do have mitochondria. They do cellular respiration. And if that seems weird, remember nighttime is a thing, so you can't do photosynthesis at night. And then plants have roots, and roots are underground, and you can't do photosynthesis if you're not exposed to light. So plants do cellular respiration. Okay, so here's again that diagram kind of tying these two together. So sunlight is captured by the plants, specifically these chloroplasts, through this process of photosynthesis, and then that process converts CO2 and water into sugars, giving oxygen off as a waste product, and then the animals eat the plants and then carry out cellular respiration, where they take that glucose, use oxygen to produce CO2 and water, and in that process, they end up making ATP. So these two diagrams are, at some level, kind of showing the same thing, the macroscopic and the microscopic levels. Okay, so how does chemical energy work? We're kind of talking about this thing called chemical energy. What is chemical energy and what's going on with that? So let's talk about it. You're familiar with using chemical energy. When you drive a car, you burn gasoline. That's chemical energy used to power your car. When you burn a match or a Bunsen burner, you are burning fuel. And again, that's chemical energy. When you join that hot dog eating contest, you are eating, sugars and other macromolecules. That is chemical energy. So if you look at all three of these fuels, you'll notice that there's a similarity. In each case, we have carbon and hydrogen. Carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen, and this one has a little bit of oxygen. And in every case, we are reacting with oxygen, and we're producing CO2 and water. And so all of these reactions, you may remember from chemistry, they're called combustion reactions, and all of them give off energy, and that should make sense to you. When you burn fuel, your car goes. When you burn a Bunsen burner, you get light and heat. When you burn glucose, you stay alive. So all of these are very similar reactions. The real key to understanding what's happening is to understand what this chemical energy is. And really what it is it's potential energy due to the separation of the electrons from the protons. So here's an atom. The protons, remember, are in the nucleus, and the electrons are in these energy levels. And this is a Bohr model of an atom, which is a little bit of a simplification, but kind of convenient for what we're trying to talk about in this class. And so there's this like separation because the electrons are sort of trapped in that energy level. And so just like if this was the floor and you lifted a ball up above the floor, there'd be potential energy. If you take that negative charge and lift it away from that positive charge, there is a potential energy there. And so you may recall we talked about this earlier this year, that if you go to a higher energy level, you increase the potential energy. And if you go back down to a lower energy, then you decrease the potential energy. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about potential energy in a molecule. So how do we harness that? Well, remind me, how are electrons shared in each of the following bonds? So if you have a carbon and a hydrogen atom bonded together, it's a covalent bond, and we talked about, was that a polar or a nonpolar bond? Think about it. Hopefully you remember that is a non-polar bond, and what that means is the electrons are shared roughly equally. Carbon could either gain 4 electrons to be in that stable configuration, or it could lose 4 electrons to be in that stable configuration. Hydrogen could gain 1 electron, or it could lose 1. So both carbon and hydrogen are pretty neutral. They don't really care. I'll take electrons, I'll lose electrons, kind of in the middle. How about carbon and oxygen, though? Oxygen is right here. And if you recall, oxygen is a very electronegative atom, meaning it really hoards those electrons. It wants them badly. And so carbon, being kind of neutral, when it's paired with oxygen, it's like, all right, fine, oxygen, take the electrons. And so the electrons actually spend more time with oxygen. So the electrons are kind of roughly equally spaced between carbon and hydrogen, but with carbon and oxygen, the electron is moved closer to that oxygen. So the key to harvesting chemical energy is that when a reaction converts a carbon-hydrogen bond to a carbon-oxygen bond, the electrons actually get closer to the nucleus because oxygen is more electronegative and potential energy is released. Again, that's kind of an abstract concept. So I kind of like, think about, like the floor. If you imagine this is the floor, there's potential energy here in this carbon-hydrogen bond, and there's less when the electron drops to the floor. And so that difference in potential energy is what's given off. Or you could think of it as a hill. The electron is at the top of a hill in a carbon-hydrogen bond, but a carbon-oxygen bond, it's kind of rolled down that hill. So that's kind of the key. And so in all these reactions that we've talked about, where we have these carbon-hydrogen bonds forming carbon-oxygen bonds, this is kind of what's happening. There's energy given off. And so there's some terms that you may have heard in chemistry. We would say that the CH, the carbon is being oxidized, meaning it's losing electrons a little bit. The electrons are getting further away from it, while the oxygen is being reduced, meaning it's gaining electrons. So basically, molecules with lots of C to H bonds are really good fuels because they have lots of these electrons that are kind of at the top of that hill. And gasoline, butane, the fuel that methane, the fuel that we use for Bunsen burners, glucose, the fuel that we use, they all have C to H bonds. And what kind of molecules provide our own cells with fuel? You ready? Ready for your mind to be blown? Holy smokes, sugars and fats. And look, sugars have carbon-hydrogen bonds, carbon-hydrogen bonds, carbon-hydrogen bonds. And fats, huge numbers of carbon-hydrogen bonds. And so this is why carbohydrates and fats are such great fuels for our body. It's because of these C to H bonds that can, when reacted with oxygen, be used to form C to O bonds. Mind blown? I hope so. So really, they're very similar processes chemically. Whether we're burning fuel or eating carbohydrates or fats or whatever the fuel is, we're basically doing the same thing. We're taking these carbon-hydrogen bonds and we're converting them to carbon-oxygen bonds. And then we're using that potential energy released to do something useful. Couple final points about harvesting chemical energy. First of all, in living things, energy is released slowly through a series of reactions, so the energy can be harvested as ATP. So when we burn fuel, it's just you kind of react the different molecules together in one big flash, and boom, you get this like heat and light coming out, and that's it. But in our bodies, it's much more complicated. And in our next screencast, we're going to see just how complicated that is. It's a lot of slow sequential steps that allow us to harvest that energy as ATP, as opposed to just giving that energy off immediately as heat and light. Also in our body, we use these things called electron carriers, and they transfer electrons from one molecule to another. You may have heard, if you had bio last year, and rich bio in particular, NAD plus and FAD are two electron carriers. I kind of symbolize them with that symbol in the diagram below. They're just a little bit more electronegative than the molecule that they're accepting an electron from. So instead of just pushing the ball down the hill, like when you burn fuel in a Bunsen burner, you kind of pass it to this NAD plus molecule, which kind of holds it for a little bit, and then passes it to another molecule, which holds it for a little bit, and then another molecule. So again, slow stepwise movement of energy. By the way, NAD plus and FADH2 are niacin. You get them from niacin. And vitamin B2, which is riboflavin. And so that's why you need those vitamins. So that's kind of it in terms of the overview setup piece. This FAD and NAD plus business is going to come back next screencast. You kind of see why I'm talking about that. So in our next screencast, we're going to kind of take these principles and figure out, okay, so what actually happens to a molecule of glucose during this process of cellular respiration? So buckle up. We'll hit it in the next screencast.